Welcome to episode 11 of It's About Data, the podcast about data, AI, analytics, and whatever the heck we feel like talking about on whatever day. And today, what we feel like talking about is getting back to you quickly with our quick takeaways from Snowflake Summit. This is with our hosts, Matt Housley of Half-Pipe Systems and Tony Bear of DB Insight. Take it away, Matt.
And we skipped over episode 9, but it's actually coming. It's not like Windows 9 where it's just going to disappear into a black hole. That is coming with Ryan Dolly. I just haven't released it on YouTube and Spotify yet.
But this is why you're no longer a data scientist, Matt, because obviously you've lost your ability to count arithmetic.
Exactly.
And you've gone from from 8 to 10, and now we're on to 11.
Well, no longer a mathematician, no longer a data scientist, apparently. Can't do like basic integer logic anymore.
Sounds good.
So you just got back from a conference, which is what this episode is about, and also why we're going to try to turn it around a bit faster and get it out the day after it's recorded.
Right, exactly. Yes, this is, we just came back from Snowflake Summit last night, spent a couple days out in Moscone, or as I like to call it, this is June, so it was Snowbricks Part 1, because next week, same time, same place, we'll be at Moscone for Databricks Summit. But anyway, very interesting, very interesting scenario this year. And I think to me, if there was just one headline, I think it's that Snowflake's starting to get its mojo back.
Yeah. And to me, they started kind of struggling. So IPO was fantastically successful, one of the biggest IPOs ever. And then after a while, huge sales pipeline, and then some of the innovations started to stall. Things like Unistore just turned into vaporware, never actually appeared. And then ChatGPT happened, and Databricks just that was their sign that it was their time, right? Like generative AI, they were all over that, and Snowflake struggled with the message on that.
Right. And you have to look at this really from the standpoint of where the market was and where each company was. Even though they were both about the same time, Snowflake started in an arguably more mature market, which is data warehouses. And they invented the cloud data warehouse. They were the cloud data warehouse that I think Amazon wishes Redshift was, and took them 10 years to get to.
Right.
Databricks started off from the get-go on data engineering, and data science, and that was a slower market, to mature.
Yes.
And so basically, by the time that, so the other thing also is that the growth trajectories of both companies, therefore, we're going to be somewhat out of phase in terms of that Snowflake had its explosive growth 5 years ago surrounding the IPO. That's when they brought Frank Slootman on to basically get them over the finish line with the IPO, get the go-to-market going. Unfortunately, product development kind of took a back seat at that point. The last few years, Snowflake has suffered for that. In the meantime, as you mentioned, Matt, basically, we were talking that ChatGPT happened, and for all the momentum that we had with classical AI, which is machine learning, really went into overdrive. When all of a sudden there was this huge urgency, for enterprises to get hip to this new technology that consumers were getting hooked on, which is generative. And so there were different, obviously different cadences here. And at this point, Databricks growth is roughly, year-on-year growth is roughly about twice that of Snowflake. That said, I believe Snowflake is still higher in revenues, and actually, they came off a very good quarter. It was almost $997 million, almost $1 billion, so almost their first $1 billion quarter.
Whoa! Okay.
So they're on a track that they could conceivably reach about $4 billion this year. Databricks is not going to be far behind. We'll be hearing a lot more about that next week. But I think more to the point, what Matt, you were talking about, I think what we're seeing here is the impact of the regime change about a year and a half ago. There was Sridhar, who really came from the product side of the organization.
Yeah.
The new focus was we need to get product back and going. And I think, as you were saying, Unistore was kind of a mirage for all these years. And through an interesting announcement this year, I think they took care of it. But basically, I think the key to their growth right now is if you look at the numbers in take-up, Cortex AI is really been at the core of it. Roughly almost about half Snowflake's customer base is now using Cortex, which is pretty amazing given that it was only introduced about 2 years ago.
Interesting. And frankly, I haven't spent a lot of hands-on time with Cortex, and it's something I just need to do to kind of compare with what Databricks has from the client perspective.
Well, it's very different. You got to keep in
Yeah.
mind that
Yeah.
even though they both claim to be reaching the same audiences or trying to go there, Snowflake comes really from an audience of business analysts and data analysts, and Databricks, comes from an audience of more technical practitioners. These are the Python, coders.
Yeah.
These are the folks who will develop their own models or do the fine tuning of their own models. So it's a much different audience. Cortex was really designed more for that, more for like an AI is simple, type of audience. Yes, Snowflake is providing development, basically development and pro coder tools, but that's really a segment that Databricks owns. So I think the key to Snowflake's success is that they designed Cortex really for where their audience was at.
Yeah. Now, one thing I'll point out here is that with Delta, and this goes back, I think, to 2017 or so, that was an effort by Databricks to pivot into Snowflake's core market.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you that at this point, I feel like it's a pretty mature data warehousing product. Even 2 years ago, I would not have said that. And that's the trouble. Like, Databricks is really good in the AI side of things, Spark, big data, to use the old term, but they're also really good on data warehousing. They've stepped all over the stuff that Snowflake does, and that's where Snowflake has had to get even better at data warehousing, and where they need other stories to say, we are on parity with Databricks. They're not as good as us at the data warehousing story, and we could do other things too.
Yeah, just one more aside on that, which is that in 2023, and that was the year where Gen AI suddenly, even though ChatGPT went, into, I guess, sort of a public beta, preview the previous November.
Right.
I just marked it on my calendar. It was about April 1st. It all of a sudden entered the discourse. But I remember having an analyst briefing with Databricks, back in the winter, in Q1, and they were mentioning data warehousing was their big focus. And that was before Gen AI forced everybody to rip up their scripts. It's not that they stopped on data warehousing, but all of a sudden the spotlight shifted. But in all this time, they've been doing a lot of work on Databricks SQL.
Yeah. And again, it feels like a very mature product now. They have a good serverless story. Like, it's efficient for organizations that are small, that don't want to run a 24-hour day data warehouse, which was always Snowflake's pitch, right? You can turn it on, you can turn it off. It's not like traditional Oracle where it's just turned on all the time and costs you money 24 hours a day.
Unless you look at OCI, where Oracle actually has been fairly aggressive in their pricing, but that's a whole other
we'll get
that's
into
a whole other
later.
podcast, and we'll be talking about that. And actually, I'm going to be getting some interesting briefings in Oracle in a few weeks, so we may have some updates there. But anyway, just to kind of move on here, I think obviously, with any vendor event this year, just like in 2023, it had to be about generative AI. This year, of course, if you didn't mention agentic, then your marketing department should be sued for malpractice.
And is that a core part of Cortex, the agentic part?
Well, it's a new extension of Cortex, and everybody's going to be doing this. But I think I'm just going to focus on one thing. There were a number of different, basically releases around agentic. But just for the sake of time, I think the one that I found kind of interesting and how it really meets Snowflake's core audience is AI SQL. Yes. And what this reminds me of a little bit, it's sort of like a next step. I remember when Oracle announced Select AI. It was meant through a SQL statement, you could trigger basically a vector search or some sort, that type of thing. And this follows from a long line of go from SQL and trigger, let's say, machine learning model. And so this basically follows in that path. But this is a case of where through a SQL statement, you can now trigger an agentic workflow. And trigger basically the agents that you've either custom developed or basically some of the prepackaged agents that you get with Cortex. I thought that was actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, very much so. And what about customer use cases? I saw that there were a lot of customer use cases on the main stage.
Yes.
What did you see in terms of customer use cases directly related to agentic?
I started, and look, we've got to keep in mind here, this is all early days.
Right.
And so I think an obvious one that I saw up on stage, I forget, which financial institution was presenting it, but looking at, at risk management. Because the thing is that risk, if you think about it, especially real-time fraud detection, is really a series of steps. Yeah. And this is the type of thing where having an autonomous agent actually can be then, does have some clear potential benefits. Of course, as long as those agents don't misfire. That's a whole other issue. It's a whole other discussion in terms of managing all these moving parts and making sure they're
Yeah.
making grounded decisions. But that was one I think. I mean, look, there are many of them, but that's one that really stick out to me.
Yeah. And I'll point out in parallel, and I learned about this at Data Driven NYC actually, that Moody's has been using something like agentic stuff internally for several years now, with the assumption that the people who use it are responsible for how they use it. And it sounds like this is a similar pitch, like very powerful, but you're responsible for what you do with it.
Exactly. Again, we need to have a whole another set of discussions on this, and I think what will be interesting, because again, we're hearing from every different vendors basically, take on this, and I think it will be interesting. And this may be like a series of episodes that we maybe do during the dog days when we have nothing better to talk about. But looking at how the different roles, all the way from Satya Nadella saying it's going to kill SaaS to SAP, and all the enterprise guys saying not so fast.
Yeah.
But whole other discussion there. I think another interesting area, and again, we're just really skipping very fast just for the sake of time. And again, we're going to revisit this stuff, after post-mortem as well. Is looking at Iceberg, and of course, Snowflake was talking about like 2x performance gains in both managed and unmanaged tables over the past year. And this is a case of where essentially, and this is going to lead to a discussion I'm hoping we're going to have next week with Ryan. Of DuckDB about Duck Lake, or what I like to call Duck Pond.
No, but it's an exciting development, but it also kind of pulls us away from this like iceberg hegemony, if we want to call it that. So I'll be very curious to see.
No, that's another discussion. We'll deal with that next week. But the thing is, what's interesting, part of it is, it's not surprising, which is that when you have all this firepower devoted to it, we are basically, it's not surprising that vendors are going to be putting a lot of effort, and that you are going to be seeing improvements. And so that it starts with something imperfect, and we figured out ways to engineer around it. I think the most interesting part is not so much the march of just incremental progress, but looking at what Snowflake is now talking about with unmanaged tables. And that gets into now some of the more interesting, esoteric discussions about, basically, can Snowflake, let's say, manage somebody else's Iceberg? And they're all going to be doing the same power. I expect to hear the same thing from Databricks next week with regard to Unity. But the idea is that, they're now putting a lot of their firepower into optimizing, Horizon with its ability to govern down to a much more granular level data that's not natively managed by Snowflake and Snowflake Iceberg tables. Again,
and let me just point out, this fits right in with what Alex Merced was talking about, composable data stack. Everyone was about the composable data stack, which means multiple vendors can work with the same data in Iceberg.
That's a nice way of saying power grab.
Right. Yeah. That.
That's really what it's all about. Who's your buddy? And that's. That battle has been as old as basically enterprise software itself, in terms of who is your prime provider. Is it your database provider? Is it your app provider? So there's no reason why the script is going to change with lake houses, especially since the target is now so inviting.
It's vendor lock-in. It's classic vendor lock-in, but while pretending to be interoperable, right? Or at least trying to be reasonably interoperable, but still lock people in.
And looking at the issue of interoperability, of course, and we'll talk a lot more about this next week, with Databricks. But what's interesting is, of course, last year, Ali basically did his announcement of Tabular right when Snowflake keynote started. We didn't have anything such similar bombshell this year, but on the last day of Snowflake, he let drop basically a link to a blog post talking about deletion vectors in Iceberg, and the significance of that is that's a Delta feature that Iceberg lacked. And so what he's saying is like, it's almost like declaring, okay, now we're declaring victory. Now they're compatible. I have a call into Snowflake right now to kind of get some of their thoughts on that. But no, it certainly is. I think it's reflecting the fact that, excuse me, and so obviously it makes me all choked up, is that we are seeing a convergence between Delta and Iceberg, mainly because Iceberg's, is essentially won the market. And as we mentioned before, actually, in our very first broadcast when we talking about SAP Databricks, is that Ali is he's certainly ambitious, but he's also pragmatic, and he's realized like
Yeah.
why fight a war over this, especially when he can spend $1 billion and pick off the leader of Tagler and now come off like a statesman. So that's going to be interesting. And I think that's something that we're going to certainly plumb a lot more on next week.
Yeah.
I am going to be getting an advanced, along with the analysts, we're getting an advanced briefing on Databricks announcements later today. But even if I already had it, I would not be able to say anything.
Of course. Yeah.
But the last piece, and this is kind of funny, and this broke, the day of the keynote. And actually, when I talked to the Crunchy Data folks, I saw we ran into each other at the keynote right before it started. And they told me that this deal happened very, very quickly. But Snowflake making the acquisition, and of all my LinkedIn posts, that's the one that went the most viral. It got to like about 20,000 hits. And that one's interesting. One is, the way Snowflake is positioning is like our customers want some PostgreSQL. Well, to me, it was more a matter of, I think, putting Unistore to rest.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. And I'm going to put a pin in one other thing, and this is something we talked about probably 2 years ago, and that is I argued at one point that Snowflake was going to become a broader cloud services provider. So we'll see. We'll see how this plays out.
Well, put this: I had a LinkedIn conversation with Doug Flora and Adam Ronthal earlier this morning about this, and my take on this is that it's not so much adding an operational database, because and even when Snowflake was originally pushing Unistore 3 years ago, they weren't saying we're really getting into the OLTP market, but there are some edge cases. What's really more about it is operational real-time analytics. So I think that this is going to be a way for them, through their zero copy, their data sharing technology, to essentially populate the mothership Snowflake warehouse to be able to do real-time operational analytics. I think that basically is the piece that so aside from basically just filling out the check mark of Unistore OLTP, I think the ultimate legacy of this is going to be that they now have operational analytics within Snowflake.
Yeah. And initially, like you said, edge cases, and then in the future, we'll see. They might broaden it out to more customer use cases. It's going to be interesting to watch.
We've just scratched the surface.
Yep. Yeah. Well, fantastic. This episode should come out pretty quick, and then we'll be talking about Duck Lake soon, and then we'll be talking about Databricks.
And we'll also be talking about, because one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about here, but I think we can get on it later, is the whole thing about dbt. And they're going a MongoDB transformation, and Snowflake is is part and parcel of this in terms of that they're going where their developers are, which is their developers want dbt, but at the same time, Snowflake is remember Apache NiFi, like from Hortonworks 10 years ago.
Yeah,
oldies but goodies. Some things just never die.
Well, and also with that announcement of OpenFlow, I think it's called, they're also going really hard after Fivetran, quite frankly, right? Like getting the data
co-opetition.
Yep.
It's all. But anyway, let's talk about it when we have a chance. Right now, let's just leave a lot of questions in everybody's minds.
That sounds fantastic. Okay, well, I will talk to you, I think, before Databricks plus AI, but have fun at Databricks plus AI as well.
We'll try. It'll be tough.
Okay.
See you later.
Take care. Bye.